My email told my husband I was stealing, so I showed him the receipts. When the accusation finally came, it wasn't shouted in anger or whispered in guilt. It was said over coffee, with a smile too calm to trust. In the quiet kitchen of the house, I thought we built together. My name is Katy Perry. I'm 36 years old and work as a financial strategist for an education nonprofit in Charleston, South Carolina. I met Daniel 6 years ago at a community fundraiser he catered as part of his hospital outreach program. He was charming, warm, a bit awkward when talking about himself, which only made me like him more back then. I was fresh off a difficult breakup and wasn't looking for anything serious. But there was something about the way he looked at me, like I wasn't something to win but someone to understand. We got married 14 months later in a small ceremony overlooking the marshes. His mother, Elaine, wore a pale blue dress and smiled throughout the ceremony. The photographer even captured a picture of her holding my hand after the vows. Everyone said we looked like family. It felt real at the time. Elaine was the kind of woman who never raised her voice, but could silence a room with just one glance. She was a retired teacher, sharp and polished, with a taste for clean countertops and structured holidays. At first, I admired her composure. I had grown up with a mother who wore her feelings like clothes, changing them often and without warning. Elaine was the opposite, controlled, careful, and underneath all that polish was something I didn't know how to name back then. I told myself she just needed time to warm up to me, but that warming never came. It was more like a series of temperature checks, subtle comments about my budgeting choices, her surprise at how much we spent on produce, her raised eyebrow when she saw a new blazer hanging by the door, nothing outright cruel, just enough to make me second-guess myself. Daniel never saw it, or maybe he didn't want to. He always said she was just trying to be helpful, that she worried because she cared, and in the beginning, I tried to believe that too. I even invited her to help with planning our kitchen remodel. She brought binders, color-coded notes, even a list of appliance discounts from a local showroom. But somehow her suggestions always replaced mine. Her preferences always felt more important. I kept brushing it off as enthusiasm. After all, she was only trying to help. It wasn't until our 3rd anniversary that I started keeping receipts. Not metaphorical ones, actual, physical receipts. It started with a conversation over dinner. Elaine had stopped by unannounced with homemade soup and a dozen white roses. She said she had reorganized the pantry while waiting for us to get home and added a few items to our grocery list because she noticed we were missing the basics. I opened the pantry later and saw that she had moved my labeled storage bins, removed most of the spices I used for meal prep, and replaced my jars of lentils and quinoa with white rice and box stuffing mix. When I asked Daniel about it, he shrugged and said she just missed having a purpose after retirement. I didn't argue. I just started quietly documenting what I contributed, what I bought, and when. The habit became a system. I tracked everything from household expenses to freelance consulting income I picked up on weekends. At first, it made me feel more secure, like I was building a quiet defense against a war I hoped would never come. But deep down, I think I always knew it would, not in a loud, dramatic way. Elaine didn't operate like that. She was patient, methodical, the kind of woman who played long games and smiled while setting the board. 6 years into our marriage, after a particularly intense quarter at work and a new round of home repairs, I decided to do something meaningful. Elaine's birthday was coming up, and she had been admiring a handcrafted watch at a local boutique. It was elegant, understated, and cost more than I usually spent on gifts, but something inside me whispered that maybe, just maybe, This was the gesture that would finally tip the scales. I picked it out myself, paid with our joint card, and immediately scheduled a transfer from my freelance account to cover the cost. I even wrapped it in linen paper and hand-wrote a note thanking her for raising the man I love. The gift never made it into her hands because before her birthday arrived, before the dinner I'd planned and the cake I'd ordered and the wine I'd chosen to pair with her favorite meal, my husband sat across from me with a folded paper in his hand and a question in his eyes I hadn't seen before. "Katie," he said slowly, "can you explain this boutique charge? Mom noticed it while helping me sort the mail." His voice wasn't accusatory yet, but it was close. I looked at the receipt I already knew was in my office filing cabinet. Then I looked at him, and in that moment, I realized Elaine hadn't just found a receipt. She had found her moment. I wish I could say I answered him calmly, that I gently explained everything, and he immediately understood. But the truth is, I froze. There was something about the way Daniel had phrased the question, something in the way his fingers gripped the corner of the statement, that told me this wasn't just curiosity, this was doubt, and it didn't start with him. Elaine had planted that seed, watered it carefully for years with subtle comments and watchful glances, and now it had finally begun to grow in the one place I never thought it could, my marriage. I told him yes, I had made the purchase. I told him it was a gift, and that the money had already been scheduled to transfer from my personal account. He nodded slowly, still staring at the paper like it held some secret he hadn't unlocked yet. Then he said, "I just didn't know we were spending this much on things." And that word, things, hung in the air longer than it should have. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I walked into my office, opened the drawer, and handed him the receipt with the date, the total, and the purpose handwritten in the margin. He didn't say anything after that. He just folded the paper, put it in his pocket, and said he needed to make a call. He didn't come back for dinner that night. I sat alone at the table with the chicken I had roasted, the wine still breathing in its glass, and I stared at the empty chair across from me, wondering when exactly the balance had shifted. I kept replaying the moment in my head, not just what he said, but how he said it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer the person he instinctively trusted. Elaine hadn't just pointed out a charge, she had questioned my motives, and Daniel, without realizing it, had echoed her voice. The days that followed were filled with silence. He left earlier for work, came home later, and avoided anything resembling a conversation. When he did speak, it was polite, short, and clinical. I didn't push. I just waited, hoping that logic would return to the space between us. But logic has little power against suspicion once it takes root. On Friday, he sent me a text from work. "Mom's coming by to drop off some soup. Hope that's okay." It wasn't a question. It was information, and it told me exactly where his head was. I came home to find the fridge reorganized, a new notepad on the counter labeled household spending, and one of my grocery receipts pinned under a magnet with a smiley face on it. I didn't say a word. I just poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch, staring at that ridiculous smiley face until it blurred into a yellow smear. The next morning, I woke early and began cleaning out the guest room. Elaine had left a scarf on the chair, a lavender-scented sachet in the drawer, and a mug with the words, "Mom knows best," on the nightstand. I gathered it all, placed it in a paper bag, and set it by the front door. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I was just clearing space. Later that day, Daniel noticed and asked if I was expecting company. I said no. He nodded and didn't ask again. But that night, as we brushed our teeth side by side, he said quietly, "You know, she's just trying to look out for us. She's worried because she sees things from the outside." I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I already knew he believed it. It wasn't until Sunday, after another cold dinner in silence, that I decided to leave. Not permanently, just long enough to think. I texted my sister Natalie and asked if I could stay with her for a few nights. She replied within seconds, "Get here. I'll pour the wine." I packed a small bag, nothing dramatic, just enough to make it through a few days. Daniel didn't ask where I was going. He just watched as I zipped the suitcase and said, "I hope you're not running away from a conversation." I stopped in the doorway, looked at him once, and said, "I'm not running. I'm preparing." Then I left. Natalie lived in a small apartment above an art supply store. She was loud, unfiltered, and allergic to anything fake. The moment I stepped inside, she took one look at my face and said, "Let me guess." Elaine finally drew blood. I didn't cry, not then, but I sat on her old corduroy couch, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like linseed oil and coffee, and I told her everything. She listened, didn't interrupt, and finally said, "You've been playing defense in a game she's been controlling. Maybe it's time to change the rules." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the ways I had tried to win Elaine over thoughtful gifts, careful dinners, accepting her uninvited help. I had turned myself inside out, trying to make her feel respected, included, loved, but none of it had been enough. And in return, she had watched me closely, waited for the moment she could point and say, "See, I knew she wasn't right for him." Lying there in the dark, I finally understood. Elaine hadn't made a mistake. She had made a move, and it was time I made one too. Natalie didn't try to comfort me in the way people usually do. She didn't offer cliches or tell me it was just a misunderstanding. What she did instead was open her laptop and start a spreadsheet. "You've been keeping receipts, right?" she asked without looking up. I nodded slowly. She turned the screen toward me and said, "Then let's map it. Not just the money, the moments." I didn't quite understand what she meant at first, but as we began listing purchases, dates, comments Elaine had made, times when Daniel changed his tone or questioned me out of the blue, something started to shift. Patterns emerged. A grocery comment in March lined up with a sudden conversation about budgeting in April. A weekend visit from Elaine in July matched almost exactly with Daniel suggesting we postpone a trip we had planned for months. It was subtle, but unmistakable. She had been nudging, suggesting, hinting, all with that same calm tone, that same faux concerned smile, until it became the lens through which Daniel viewed our life. And the terrifying part was that I had let it happen. Not because I was weak, but because I was trying to keep peace in a war I didn't even know had started. That night, I opened my work laptop and began gathering all the financial documents I had kept. Bank statements, transfer records, freelance invoices, credit card breakdowns by category, even screen captures of Venmo payments I had made to cover joint dinners or small home repairs. I organized them by month and labeled everything clearly. I didn't know exactly what I was building, but I knew why I was doing it. Not to beg for trust, but to make the truth undeniable. I didn't sleep much. The blue light of the screen reflected off Natalie's tiny apartment walls until sunrise. She brought me coffee in silence the next morning and pointed at the growing folders on my desktop. "This is going to shake something loose," she said. You ready for what happens when it does? I wasn't sure, but I knew I couldn't go back to pretending that afternoon. I called Hannah, my colleague at the nonprofit. She was smart, steady, and had quietly seen more than I'd realized. I asked if we could meet outside work, and within an hour, we were sitting on her porch with 2 iced teas and the quiet weight of real conversation between us. I told her about the gift, the accusation, and the emotional vacuum that had followed. She listened closely, then asked a single question. If this were happening to one of the women we support in our programs, what would you tell her to do? The answer was obvious. I'd tell her to document everything, protect her independence, and stop hoping people would defend her without being shown the truth. Hannah nodded. Then do the same for yourself. Something clicked into place then. I had spent too long waiting for permission to defend my own integrity. That evening, I returned home briefly while Daniel was at work. The house felt unfamiliar. It smelled like Elaine's perfume and someone else's soup. Her slippers were by the couch. A second toothbrush had appeared in the master bathroom. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. I walked straight to the office and checked the drawer where I had hidden the birthday gift. It was still there, wrapped and untouched. But the file folders around it had clearly been disturbed, papers out of order, tabs bent in odd places. I took photos of everything and sealed the drawer with a numbered lock I had used back in college for internship documents. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being precise. I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted the facts to speak first. I spent the next week at Natalie's. I refined the spreadsheet. I created a second version with visuals, color-coded blocks that showed when Elaine had visited and what conversations followed. It was clean, direct, undeniable. I printed everything, hole-punched the sheets, and placed them into a binder labeled Joint Financial Timeline. I knew how it looked. Cold, excessive, maybe even obsessive. But I also knew that when you're dealing with someone who manipulates through implication, you need truth that's visible, organized, and calm on Saturday morning. I called Daniel. I asked him to meet me for coffee alone. He hesitated, then agreed. We met at a quiet cafe near the river where we had once picked out wedding invitations. He was cautious, but not hostile. I placed the binder between us and said nothing for nearly a minute. Then I opened to the first tab. This is what really happened, I said softly. Before you decide who I am or what I've done, read this. Read. He didn't speak for a long time. His hands hovered over the pages, but he didn't turn them. Instead, he looked at me with something I hadn't seen in weeks: conflict, not anger, not betrayal, just the dawning discomfort of a man who had been handed the truth and realized it didn't match the story he had quietly accepted. Finally, he asked, "Why didn't you just tell me sooner?" I smiled faintly and said, "Because telling you wasn't enough anymore. I had to show you." I left him with the binder and walked away, not to punish him, but because I needed him to sit with the evidence alone, without his mother nearby to rewrite the margins. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept deeply. 3 days passed without a word from Daniel. I didn't call, didn't text, didn't ask how the binder had landed in his hands or what Elaine had to say after she inevitably snooped through it. I focused on my work during the day and spent my evenings walking through Natalie's neighborhood, watching the Spanish moss sway over the sidewalks like time itself had slowed to think. I wasn't waiting for a dramatic response. I had stopped hoping for redemption from him or understanding from her. What I wanted was clarity, even if it came wrapped in silence. On the 4th morning, I found an email from Daniel No subject line, no pleasantries, just a message with 2 lines. I've read everything. We need to talk. That afternoon, we met at a park by the water, the same place he had once told me he wanted to grow old in, just the 2 of us, drinking coffee and reading books in silence. He looked older already, not in a way that came from age, but from the realization that something he believed in had cracked. We sat on opposite ends of the bench, and for a while, the only sound was the gulls and the wind. He apologized, not in the way people do to end a fight, but in the way someone does when they realize they've failed someone they promised to protect. He said he hadn't known how much his mother's voice had colored his perception until he saw it laid out in timelines and receipts. He said it made him sick to realize he had asked me to justify myself more than once, just because someone else planted the idea that I might not be honest. He also admitted that he didn't know how to fix it. I told him I wasn't expecting him to fix anything. What I wanted was the truth about whether he still saw us as a team, or if he had already chosen sides and was now just backpedaling out of guilt. He didn't answer that part, not directly. Instead, he said something that stuck with me. She moved into our space the moment I gave her the silence to do it. I didn't push back. And now it's not just her fault. That was the first time I saw him not as a husband, but as a man raised by someone who taught him that peace was bought with compliance, and for years, I had paid the price for that lesson. We didn't talk about the watch, or the dinner that never happened, or the gift that still sat unopened. Instead, we talked about boundaries, something we had never truly built between us and Elaine. I told him I would not come back to the house until he reclaimed that space, not just physically, but emotionally. He said he understood. Then he told me something unexpected. Elaine had been unusually quiet since he confronted her. She didn't deny the timeline or the data. Instead, she cried. She said I had twisted her intentions, made her look like a villain, and that she had always tried to be part of my life. But she couldn't explain why her version of helping always left me feeling like I was drowning in doubt. When Daniel asked her that directly, she told him some women were simply too sensitive. That word landed like a stone. Sensitive. The same one she had used when I cried at our wedding dinner after she changed the seating chart without telling me. The same one she used when she laughed at my recipe choices, or when I asked her not to reorganize our closet. Every time I had asked for respect, she had labeled it as emotional instability, and Daniel had believed it for years. Later that night, I returned to the house to collect more things. Daniel had made arrangements for Elaine to stay elsewhere for a few days. The space smelled like citrus and something faintly synthetic. A reminder that someone had tried to erase the scent of conflict. In the office, I checked the drawer again. Everything was in place. But as I scanned through a folder I hadn't looked at before, I found something strange. A note, small, handwritten, folded neatly between pages of our household budget. It was in Elaine's handwriting. It said, "Some lessons must be taught with distance. He'll see eventually." I stared at the words for a long time. Then I took a photo and placed the note exactly where I found it. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't just been interfering, she had been orchestrating, anticipating my withdrawal, betting on it even, and worse. She had assumed Daniel would take the bait. I didn't show him the note right away. I wanted to wait, to see if his actions aligned with his words. The next morning, I received another message from him. I'm talking to her, not a conversation, a boundary, that afternoon. He sent me a photo. It was of the guest room clean, empty, the bed stripped, the lavender sachet gone, Underneath the photo, a message starting over. Our terms. It wasn't an apology. It was an offering. And as small as it was more than I had expected, but I still wasn't ready to go back. Not yet. The foundation might have stopped shaking, but I needed to see if it could hold. I returned to Natalie's for what I told myself would be one more night. But the truth is, I wasn't ready to be in that house again. Not yet. It wasn't about fear or bitterness. It was about space. Space to think without Elaine's scent in the hallway, without Daniel's half-spoken guilt trailing behind me like a fog. That evening, Natalie poured us both a glass of wine and asked a simple question I hadn't let myself consider. If he hadn't seen the binder, do you think he would have ever believed you? I didn't answer right away because the question wasn't cruel. It was honest. And deep down, I knew the answer. I had spent so long trying to be understood that I never stopped to question whether the person I was trying to reach was even capable of seeing me clearly anymore. I had built systems of proof, documented kindnesses, defended intentions, all while hoping that truth alone would be enough to win against implication. But sometimes, the people we love are too afraid of conflict to protect us from it. And silence, I've learned, can be just as damaging as accusation. The next morning, I woke early and began writing not emails or explanations, but questions. Questions I would ask if I were coaching someone else through this situation. What boundaries were crossed? What parts of myself had I compromised? What would forgiveness even look like now? By noon, I had filled 6 pages, not with answers, but with clarity. Then I did something unexpected. I called Elaine. She didn't sound surprised to hear from me. In fact, she sounded composed, almost curious. I told her I wanted to meet in person, just the two of us, in a public space. She agreed, her tone sweet and slightly theatrical, like she was already scripting how the conversation would go. We met at a cafe near her old school, a place she once said felt like home. She arrived 10 minutes early, of course, in a pale blouse and pearls, sipping chamomile tea as if we were simply catching up. I sat across from her, calm, silent, letting the weight of her performance hang between us. She started the conversation the way she always did, with observations masked as concern. "You've lost weight. Are you eating enough?" she asked, her voice wrapped in silk. I smiled faintly and replied that stress tends to have that effect. Then I told her why I had asked to meet. I said I wanted to understand, not just what she did, but why. I asked her when she decided I wasn't good enough for her son. She blinked at that, just once. Then she said something that finally revealed more truth than all her polished smiles ever could. "I didn't decide that. I just never saw you as a natural fit. You're competent, but you don't lead with softness, and Daniel needs softness." It wasn't rage that filled me in that moment. It was relief. Relief that the mask had finally cracked. I asked her if it made her feel powerful to orchestrate doubt behind the scenes, if planting suspicions made her feel like she was still needed. She didn't deny it. She just said, "Mothers know things. We sense imbalances before they become problems." I told her calmly that this wasn't about balance. This was about control. And I reminded her that any sense of closeness she had created with Daniel had come at the cost of our marriage. She changed tactics then, just as I expected. She started talking about her generation, about sacrifice, about how no one ever spoke openly in her time, and how she was simply doing what she thought was best. I let her speak. I didn't interrupt. And when she finished, I said thank you for confirming everything I had felt but never been able to prove. I stood up, placed the check on the table, and told her that from now on, all communication would be coordinated through Daniel. No more texts, no more unscheduled visits, no more strategic kindness. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, and then she gave me that same faint smile she always did when she lost a round but refused to admit it. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said. The oldest deflection in the book. I left without responding. She had finally shown her cards, and I no longer needed to play. That evening, I returned to the house for good. Daniel was there, waiting in the kitchen, the binder now closed and placed on the counter like a book he'd finished but couldn't shelve. He didn't speak immediately. He just stepped aside to let me pass, then asked if we could sit down. We talked for 2 hours about the distance, the choices, the silence. He said he wanted to rebuild, not just trust, but the partnership we used to have. I told him rebuilding starts with structure, and structure starts with boundaries, together. We drafted rules not as a punishment, but as a promise. No more financial decisions without both of us involved, no third-party mediation, no emotional triangulation. If something felt off, we'd say it aloud before someone else could weaponize it in whispers. It was awkward at first, like two people learning a new language, but it was honest. And for the first time in a long while, I believed that might be enough. The first week back in the house felt like walking across glass barefoot. Everything looked familiar, but carried a new kind of tension. Not from blame, but from awareness. Daniel and I moved carefully, like people sharing a fragile object neither of us knew how to hold properly anymore. We agreed to ease back into a rhythm, not by pretending the fracture hadn't happened, but by building around it. We started with practical things, shared calendars, weekly budget check-ins, joint dinners where phones stayed out of reach and attention stayed in the room. It wasn't romantic or emotional. It was structured. And in some strange way, that structure became comforting, like scaffolding around a damaged building, not beautiful, but strong enough to keep everything from falling further apart. Elaine stayed distant, which surprised me at first. Then Daniel told me he had spoken with her again, more firmly this time, and made it clear that any further involvement in our marriage would result in a complete cutoff. He said she cried again, then shifted quickly into martyr mode, saying that she never felt welcome, that she was being erased, that I had always misunderstood her. Daniel said he didn't argue. He just repeated the boundaries and told her they weren't negotiable. I asked him if he believed her tears. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "I think she believes her own version, but that doesn't mean I have to live by it anymore." That sentence carried more growth than any apology ever could. Still, change wasn't immediate. Habits don't vanish just because we name them. There were moments when old patterns tried to creep back in, especially when we disagreed about small things. I caught myself anticipating judgment, bracing for correction, even when none came. One night, I made a comment about needing a new laptop for work, and Daniel instinctively asked, "Do we really need to spend that much?" The words weren't malicious, but they echoed with old shadows. I paused, looked at him, and asked gently, "Is that your concern or someone else's voice in your head?" He blinked, then nodded. "You're right. That's not mine. It was a small win, but it mattered." At work, things shifted too. I became more direct with clients, more protective of my time, less eager to explain decisions that didn't need defending. Hannah noticed it first. She pulled me aside after a meeting and said, "Whatever storm you just walked through, It made you sharper. I smiled and said, it taught me where my edges actually are. That was the thing about this whole ordeal. It didn't just test my marriage. It tested how much I trusted my own instincts. And for the first time in a long time, I was learning to listen to them without guilt. Around the 4th week, Daniel suggested something unexpected. He asked if we should return the watch. It had stayed in its box all this time, untouched, like a symbol of the peace offering that never landed. He said it felt wrong to keep something so expensive when its original purpose had been warped. I agreed. We went together to the boutique, hand in hand but quiet, not in tension, just in reflection. The sales associate recognized me immediately and asked if something was wrong with the item. I said no, it was perfect. But sometimes gifts carry too much story to be worn lightly. Instead of getting a refund, we exchanged it for something simpler, a silver pen, engraved with the words, "Begin Again." We placed it on the desk in our shared office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that no matter how much noise people bring into your life, there's always a moment when you get to decide what comes next. It was during that drive home that I realized something had shifted. I no longer needed Elaine's approval. I no longer feared her judgment. I no longer designed my life around making other people comfortable. And that change didn't come from a grand confrontation or a final victory. It came from the quiet decision to reclaim authorship over my own story. We didn't celebrate the moment with champagne or speeches. We went grocery shopping. We made dinner. We watched a documentary on coral reef restoration and fell asleep on the couch halfway through. But there was peace in the ordinary, a peace I hadn't known I was missing until it returned. Daniel didn't become a different man overnight. He still struggled with guilt. He still questioned himself more often than he liked, but he no longer defended the indefensible. And for me, that was enough to stay in the room. A few weeks later, something subtle began to happen. The tension didn't disappear, but it stopped being the default. We started laughing again, not because everything was healed, but because we remembered how we used to sound before whispers got louder than trust. Daniel began initiating conversations about things we had once avoided: his guilt, his silence, his need to please his mother, even when it cost us. He admitted that he had confused being a good son with being an absent husband, and that realization had shaken him more than anything in that binder. I listened, not because I needed him to be punished, but because I needed to know he was finally present, and slowly, he was. One Saturday morning, we found ourselves sorting through an old filing box filled with cards and mementos from our early years. Tucked between holiday photos and anniversary notes was a letter Elaine had written us as a wedding gift. It was printed on ivory stationery, signed in looping cursive, and filled with gentle warnings disguised as blessings. She had written that marriage was sacred, but it required constant maintenance, especially when outside influences started interfering at the time. I had taken that as a warning about work stress or social pressure. Now, reading it again, I understood she meant me. From the beginning, she had written herself into our story as a necessary balance, a silent third voice in a two-person equation. I set the letter aside without comment, but Daniel noticed. He picked it up, skimmed it, and said, "She always thought love was something to monitor, not trust." I nodded and said, "That's because control was her language, not care." He didn't argue. I began to approach everything differently after that. At work, I delegated more. At home, I protected my routines. And in my own mind, I stopped apologizing for needing space. I noticed how often women like me were expected to explain our logic, justify our tone, soften our boundaries for the comfort of others, but not anymore. I didn't become aggressive or harsh. I became clear, and clarity, I learned, is often mistaken for rebellion when people are used to your compliance. Elaine eventually reached out again, this time with an invitation. She was hosting a family dinner and wanted us to attend. No pressure, she said, just family. Daniel looked at me when the invitation came, silently asking what I wanted to do for the first time. I didn't feel the need to avoid it. I said yes, but on my terms. We arrived early, not to help set up, but to make a statement. We brought a modest bottle of wine and a store-bought pie. Nothing extravagant, nothing performative. The house looked the same, pristine and curated, like it had been prepped for a lifestyle magazine shoot. Elaine greeted us with a smile, just a little too practiced, and her hug lingered half a second too long. During dinner, she was careful with her words, asking about my work without commenting on my appearance, complimenting the pie as if it were a peace offering. I responded politely, but not warmly. I wasn't playing roles anymore. I was observing. Near the end of the meal, she said something that caught both of us off guard. I've realized that sometimes protecting your children means letting go of the version of their life you imagined. It was her version of an apology, though it never named the harm directly. Still, Daniel reached for my hand under the table, a quiet gesture of solidarity that said more than her words ever could. On the drive home, we didn't talk much, but when we got to the front door, I paused and looked at him. Did you believe her? He took a breath, then said, I believed she believed herself. But I only trust you. And for once, I didn't need proof of that. I just felt it. We continued to rebuild our lives not with grand gestures, but with small consistencies, shared chores, clear calendars, undivided time, trust. I learned, wasn't about never being questioned. It was about being believed when you answer. And Daniel was learning, slowly but sincerely, how to believe out loud. One evening, while I was prepping for a client call, I noticed the binder still sitting on the office shelf. I asked if we should put it away. He shook his head. No, let it stay. Not as a weapon, as a record of how far we let things go before we learned how to stop them. I didn't say anything, but I left it there. Not because I needed it anymore, but because I wanted to remember that silence had almost cost me my voice. Several weeks after that family dinner, something shifted for good. It wasn't just that the tension had calmed or that Daniel and I had found a better rhythm. It was that I no longer carried the quiet fear that everything I did would be questioned, scrutinized, or reframed by someone who only saw me through the lens of competition. Elaine didn't reach out much after that, but when she did, her tone had changed. No more unsolicited advice, no more subtle jabs wrapped in sweet language. It wasn't warmth, but it was distance, and for me, that was enough. I didn't need her love. I needed her absence in the spaces that belonged to me. Daniel continued to hold the line, gently but firmly, and I saw how difficult it was for him, not because he disagreed with the boundaries, but because for the first time in his life, he was learning how to exist outside of her approval. That kind of detachment takes time, but he was doing the work, and I didn't need him to be perfect. I just needed him to keep choosing the partnership over the performance. One afternoon, I came home to find a package on our porch. No return address, just a plain brown box with my name carefully written in black ink. Inside was the Mom Knows Best mug Elaine had left behind when she first overstepped into our guest room, along with a short note that read, figured this belongs with you now." I stared at it for a long moment, unsure if it was an apology or another passive-aggressive swipe. Maybe it was both. I placed the mug on the counter without comment. That evening, Daniel saw it and raised an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to mean something?" I shrugged and replied, "It means she still wants to write footnotes into chapters she no longer appears in." He didn't laugh, but he smiled faintly. That was enough. That was, in my work life, I noticed other changes too. I began taking up space differently in meetings, pushing back when clients overreached, and protecting my team from burnout with a clarity I didn't know I had access to before. One junior associate came to my office after a client call and said, "You speak like everything you say is already proven." I told her that comes from learning not to wait for people to believe you before you speak. It wasn't a lesson I had sought, but it was one I was grateful for. Quiet resilience isn't always born from peace. Sometimes it's forged in rooms where you were made to prove your worth before anyone even listened. A few months later, Daniel and I decided to take a short trip out of town, just the two of us, nothing fancy, just a cabin in the mountains where the air felt quieter than the city ever allowed. We hiked, read books, cooked together without talking about anything important. It was the kind of silence that healed instead of hovered. On the last night, as we sat on the porch watching the trees sway in the wind, Daniel asked me something I hadn't expected. If all this hadn't happened, if she hadn't accused you, if I hadn't doubted you, do you think we would have lasted? I didn't answer right away. I let the question hang between us like mist. Then I said, "Maybe, but it wouldn't have been a marriage. It would have been survival, and I'm not built for that kind of life." He nodded slowly. "Me neither. Not anymore." That was the first time I believed we were truly on the same side, not just as partners who had survived something, but as people who had learned to see each other without interference. When we returned, I boxed up the binder, not because I wanted to forget, but because I no longer needed it in arm's reach. It had served its purpose, not just to prove my integrity, but to protect it long enough for me to remember I never needed to justify my presence in my own life. I placed the box in the back of our closet, behind old coats and outdated paperwork, not hidden, just quiet. I left the Mom Knows Best mug in the cabinet too, tucked in the back behind travel tumblers and mismatched glassware, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a reminder that no one gets to define what care looks like in your home unless they live inside its walls. That night, as I brushed my teeth and turned off the lights, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. Same eyes, same face, but something behind the expression had changed. Not bitterness, not pride, just stillness. The kind that comes from surviving a storm without letting it become your identity. As I got into bed, Daniel reached for my hand the way he always used to before the silence took hold. This time, I held it back without flinching. 6 months after everything unraveled, life had settled into a version I hadn't imagined, but somehow preferred. There were no grand statements, no final showdowns, no viral moments of vindication, just quiet progress. My relationship with Daniel had become steady again, not because we had returned to what we were, but because we had rebuilt something newer, smaller, and more intentional. There were still moments when one of us would slip, when old habits tried to resurface, when silence threatened to replace honesty, but we recognized them faster now. And instead of pretending everything was fine, we named what we felt and sat with it, even when it was uncomfortable, Elaine didn't disappear entirely, but she became a different kind of presence, distant, measured, cautiously polite. She still sent birthday cards and still invited us to holiday dinners. But the tone had changed. She no longer treated our boundaries as suggestions. She treated them as walls she could no longer paint over, I think, in her own way. She came to understand that influence built on silence doesn't survive once the silence ends. Daniel visited her occasionally, and I didn't stop him, but he always came back different, less conflicted, less eager to translate her meaning. He had learned how to hear her without letting her words become law, and that was enough for me. My work had changed too, not in title or salary, but in how I showed up. I no longer rushed to fill gaps that weren't mine. I no longer made myself small to make others feel taller. I mentored younger women more deliberately, and when they came to me with stories that mirrored what I'd lived through, I didn't give them advice. I asked them questions, the same way Natalie had asked me, "What do you know to be true, even when no one else validates it? What would you do if no one ever apologized, but you still needed to move forward?" These weren't easy questions, but they were necessary, because sometimes strength doesn't look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like calm, controlled refusal to be erased. There was one moment that surprised me, a quiet Saturday when Daniel and I were organizing the attic. We were sorting through old boxes, deciding what to keep, what to donate, and what had simply followed us from apartment to apartment because we never questioned its place. I found the blue gift box, the one that was meant to hold the watch, the one that never reached Elaine's hands. I held it in silence for a while, the ribbon slightly bent, the paper still uncreased. Daniel saw it and said, "I forgot we still had that." I didn't respond. I just opened it, half expecting the air inside to carry some residue of what we had been through. It didn't. It was just a box. I closed it and said, "Let's give it away." Not the watch, we had long since exchanged that, but the box. The whole idea of gifting as a form of negotiation. I was done offering parts of myself in wrapping paper. After that, I stopped collecting receipts, not because I no longer cared about tracking or because I trusted blindly again, but because I no longer lived in fear of being misread. I had proof now, not on paper, but in experience, in the steadiness of my own reactions, in the way I could say no without explanation. One afternoon, while at the grocery store, the cashier asked if I wanted my receipt. Without thinking, I said, "No thanks," and walked away. It was the first time in years that I didn't second-guess that answer. I didn't need a trail. I didn't need evidence. I just needed to live like someone who knew where she stood. That night, I told Daniel about it. He didn't make it dramatic. He just nodded and said, "That's real progress," then handed me a glass of water and asked what I wanted for dinner. It was the kind of moment you don't notice unless you've lived through the opposite. Calm, respectful, equal. We ate quietly that evening. No tension, no unspoken weight. Just two people who had weathered a storm and decided, independently and together, to build something stronger than what came before. I don't think stories like mine end with applause. They end with clarity, with knowing the difference between peace and appeasement, between kindness and erasure, between being accepted and being allowed. And when I look back on what Elaine tried to do, on how long I let it happen, how long I kept receipts to prove I belonged, I don't feel anger. I feel distance. the kind of distance you create when you stop asking for a seat at the table and start building your own. It's strange how something as ordinary as declining a receipt can become the closing scene of a long internal war. That quiet moment in the grocery store wasn't about money or trust or convenience. It was about knowing I no longer lived my life expecting to be cross-examined. I walked out with a bag of groceries, no paper trail, and a heart that didn't beat faster at the thought of needing one. That was what healing looked like for me. Not loud, not perfect, but steady. Daniel and I continued, not as some triumphant couple who had survived betrayal, but as two people who had learned the true cost of silence and what it meant to stay anyway. We weren't defined by the wound. We were defined by how we tended to it. He had to rebuild my trust without asking for shortcuts. I had to learn how to let him. And through it all, there was a new kind of honesty between us. One that didn't rely on old roles. One that didn't require me to be the fixer or him to be the bridge between his mother and our home. He started telling people no. I started telling myself yes. Elaine faded further into the periphery. She didn't cause trouble anymore, but she never truly apologized either. I stopped waiting for her to. I realized that some people don't change because they see the error of their ways. They change because the system that enabled their behavior no longer exists. She could no longer manipulate from a distance or insert herself into our decision-making. We had closed that door, gently but firmly, and she no longer had a key. The tension didn't dissolve completely, but it became irrelevant, and irrelevant people, I've learned, lose their power the moment you stop adjusting your life around them. Months passed, and I felt lighter. I traveled more for work. I spent more time with Natalie, who never let me forget who I was when everything felt like it was falling apart. I began writing small pieces, personal essays, reflections for a local newsletter that focused on women navigating quiet resilience. One piece in particular, titled Documenting to Survive, gained unexpected traction. Women from different cities, backgrounds, and generations sent notes saying they'd kept their own versions of binders, of screenshots, of timelines, not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. That collective recognition reminded me that what I went through wasn't an isolated story. It was just one of many. I never wrote about Elaine by name. I never even referred to her directly. Instead, I wrote about the feeling of being disbelieved by someone who claims to love you. I wrote about the slow erosion of self-worth when every choice is questioned in a voice coated with concern. I wrote about how it feels to sleep next to someone who doesn't realize he's holding a mirror for someone else's doubt. And then I wrote about choosing yourself, about reclaiming your story, about choosing to stay not because you have something to prove, but because both of you have finally learned how to listen. One Sunday morning, over coffee and a quiet kitchen, Daniel asked me if I ever thought about what might have happened if we hadn't gone through any of it. I told him I used to. I used to wish we could go back to before it all cracked open. But now, I don't, because going back would mean going blind again, and I'd rather live with clear eyes, even if the view sometimes stings. He nodded, reached across the table, and tapped my wedding ring once. I see you, he said, and I believed him. There's no fairy tale ending here. No glossy image of a perfect marriage reclaimed. There's just this, two people sitting in the aftermath of something difficult, still willing to try, still choosing each other without illusions, still building trust the slow, manual way. And for me, that's more satisfying than any dramatic comeback or moment of revenge, because this wasn't about winning. It was about not disappearing, about knowing who I am when no one else is validating the version I present. And that kind of clarity doesn't come often. When it does, it changes everything. So now I ask you, not as a storyteller, but as someone who's walked through the long corridors of doubt and come out the other side, have you ever had to prove your truth to someone who claimed to love you? And when the moment came, did you show them your receipts, or did you finally walk away?